Welcome back. I'd like to introduce you to my friends, Lauren and Johanna Champa. This might be also a great opportunity for me to thank all of the volunteers who helped make Tell Us Something happen this time. Thank you, Stephanie and Yupa, for handing out handbills. Thank you, Bob, for all of the work that you're doing with the videos. Thank you, Lauren and Johanna, tonight. Thank you most especially to Joyce Gibbs. She has been busting her ass to try to help me and my gimpy ass. So thanks, Joyce. Who? Oh, yes, Jenny and Ellie and all the people. All the people. Thank you. Susan Maruka helped me go buy these jeans. Marissa France. All the things. So thank you so much to all the volunteers and helpers. Always look for the helpers. So we're going to do the audience participation piece. Lauren and Johanna are going to do 5 minutes of your anonymous stories, and then we'll come back for the second half of Tell Us Something. Can we get 5 minutes on the timer or somebody's phone, please? Okay, that works. All right, great.
Hello. Ooh. Okay. I have been informally adopted by my dead husband's dead wife's family. How is this possible? After she died of cancer in 1996, he began dating. We met in 2002. We married in 2010. He died of cancer in 2011. In 2012, I returned her things he had kept to her family. We've been family ever since. Explaining our relationship at family gatherings begins, it's complicated.
A night to remember. My husband and I were living in Nevada at the time. We decided to spend our Southwest Airline miles on a weekend in Santa Fe. Arriving late on a Friday night, we headed to Canyon Road, hoping that some of the Santa Fe's infamous art galleries would still be open. Although most were dark and shuttered, the lights were on and people were streaming into one, a lovely craftsman's building. The front room had a table at one side with photos. Info about the featured artists, we assumed skipped it, and began to explore the multiple small rooms filled with art. Uniformed waiters offered us wine and finger foods. This weekend was starting out well. We wandered into an outdoor sculpture garden, and my husband noted, "Well, looks like an escape route out this way." We heard someone inside calling the guests to gather in the front room. My husband offered to round up the stragglers, and shortly, 50 to 60 people were crammed together as candles were lit on the table and a few people started weeping softly. The woman standing at the table sighed deeply and then asked if anyone wanted to start by sharing their memories of the beloved. Oh my God, it was a wake. A waiter paused in front of us, took our empty wine glasses, and offered us fresh glasses. That was easy for him to do, as we were standing in the very front of the crowd of mourners. My husband, accepting another glass, avoided my stare. He downed it, took my hand, and started edging slowly to his left, heading for the sculpture garden and escape. Glass in hand, he edged toward the door. This time, I avoided all eye contact. A few minutes later, the glass safely on a marble statue, we left through the gate, a night to remember.
Age 26, female, student working full-time, 6 years of hardship. Life is hardly one complication after another, as I'm sure it is for almost everyone here. Writing a story about these complications in a succinct manner is a complication in itself. So let me give this a shot. A month ago, my wife left me after giving me 2 days' notice. I didn't know we had issues so drastic to warrant this. We are still together, but we are not. I want her to be happy no matter what. Foreshadows miscategorized to protect our current state. Illusions swept to subconscious, allowing the final chapter of bliss. Only our bones reverberate, truths hidden deep by minds and masked by hearts. Their longing ache, betraying false solace with immutable reality.
I was pulled over by the Monties while peeing out the passenger side door. It's complicated.
Try to keep rents low in Missoula is complicated. As an owner of a fourplex close to the U and downtown, I try to keep the cost to my renters such that those working full-time at minimum wage can afford them, and not offer slum conditions. But Missoula property taxes keep going up. Last year, they almost doubled for me, and maintenance costs rises all the time. I love my renters, but I can't personally support them. It's complicated.
Losing your faithful companion of 14 years, the baby I didn't birth, the one we poured our love into, and now it's the two of us, alone. People I said I would know it was time, and I second-guessed myself. Grief does weird things.
I was seeing a guy casually for several months that I met on Tinder. Things fizzled out, as Tinder dates do. A few weeks later, I met a new guy, had a date, went to his apartment. I told him that he could pass as my last Tinder date's brother. He asked his name. I told him. He said, "No way, that's my roommate." I proceeded to make it awkward as hell. Then I went home. What can I say? I have a type. Thank you.
So, about 3 years ago, I dated a guy for a few months, and he ended the relationship. He said he wasn't ready for a commitment. Oddly, we were able to stay kinda sorta friends. About a year ago, he begged me for a second chance, and though very hesitant, I decided to give him another chance. 6 months later, I was sure I was going to marry him. Then, he broke up with me. Again. I was heartbroken, but we were able to connect as friends again later, and he is now my best friend. I'm now in a different relationship that has been going on for about a year. I love my new partner, but I'm also realizing that I still love my ex, AKA my best friend. It's complicated.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Johanna. Are you ready for Act 2? Are you having a good time? Chris LaTray is a writer, a walker, and a photographer. His freelance writing and/or photography has appeared in various regional and national publications. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, was recently released via Riverfeet Press. Chris LaTray is Chippewa-Cree Métis and is an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. Please welcome Chris LaTray.
Thanks, Mark. Did someone just wolf whistle? I could have sworn I heard one. So there's a story in my family about my father. This is late 60s, early 70s, I'm not sure what year. Out at the mill in Frenchtown. He's fresh out of the Navy, few years. And he's leaning on a rail in the mill proper. The guy walks up to him. It's kind of an apocryphal story, so you don't necessarily know what's true and what isn't. But when my dad would tell me, it's his foreman. He walks up on me, slaps him on the back, and he says, "How's it going, Chief?" Which for my dad was the only match you needed to light for the gasoline of rage that fueled him. And he chased this guy from one end of the mill to the other before he finally caught him. And when my dad would tell me the story, he said, I grabbed that son of a bitch by the throat and I said, "Don't you ever fucking talk to me again." And he swears that he never did. And I've heard that story from my dad. I heard it from my sister who worked there for a while. I heard it from a couple other people. The reason my dad was so angry is he was Indian and he hated the fact that he was Indian. And calling an Indian chief is something like calling an Indian squaw or naming a football team Redskins. You don't know what it means unless you live it. And my dad lived it. And to wonder how and why he felt that way, you have to kind of do a certain amount of speculation because he never talked about it until the day he died. And as Mark announced, I am enrolled with the Little Shell tribe of Montana. And when my dad died on October 30th, 2014, I don't know if he ever even heard of the Little Shell tribe. It's only through investigation of my own that I've learned our family lineage. And if he knew it, he never talked about it. My grandparents would talk about it, that we were Indians. They said we were Chippewa. But when they died, I don't necessarily know if they knew about the Little Shell. So who are the Little Shell? Well, the Little Shell tribe is a part named after a specific band led by a chief named Little Shell, who broke away as a result of the 1892 Macomber Commission. So we are a people, a part of the larger Pembina tribe of Indians that live kind of in what we would call the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, Canada. We're talking the Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, Chippewa. Like a horse or a dog, I have papers. My papers say I'm Chippewa-Cree Métis. But the Little Shell in 1892, the Macomber Commission, they came to that part of the country and saw all this land that the Indians had, and they said, we want it. We're going to pay you fair market value, which was like $1 an acre. And the result of that was the creation of the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. Little Shell said, nah, we're not interested. And the Fed said, well, if you guys don't sign on to this and go on the reservation, we're going to say that you essentially don't exist, which is true. We're a not federally recognized tribe. Little Shell said, you know what? We don't recognize your borders. We don't recognize your laws, so we're just not going to play. We don't care what you say about our existence because we know who we are. Which to me, I love the fact that part of my lineage goes all the way back to just a big fuck you to the man. And I wish my dad knew about that. So I try and understand, the downside of that is that my grandparents' generation could be deported to Canada as Métis people. So they didn't want people to know they were Indian. Think about, we're only a couple generations removed from Native children being removed from their families so that they didn't learn their language and sent to these boarding schools. I don't know my language, which is not a surprise because I didn't know up until about a decade ago who I was. So you can understand why people like my father and the generation before him would try and keep it on the down low exactly what and where they came from. But we don't have a reservation. We have small concentrated communities in towns like Great Falls and Lewistown and places like that. But, my dad never talked about it, and I like to think about what it was like for him growing up in the 50s in towns like Anaconda and Hamilton, and what it was like with no community to be a part of, being called, Indian or half-breed, which is what, the derogatory term for what the Métis people are, or prairie nigger, things like that. What was it like to grow up that way with nobody to back you up? And your father is an alcoholic and he beats you. Who would own that you were Indian? Who is your community at that point? Your community becomes your rage and your ability to fight. And that's what my dad learned. He learned to drink probably by the time he was 13. The only thing that saved him was the Navy. And he came out of the Navy reinventing himself as someone who would only claim to be white. My grandparents would talk about us being Chippewa, and he would say, "Oh, that's bullshit." So you understand why, as a racist, probably the people he hated the most were Indians. And I grew up wondering who we are and where we came from. But at the same time, I've learned some of that rage for different reasons. I learned my rage because everybody made fun of me for being fat. I don't recall being, hassled about being Indian, but it could have happened. People made comments here and there. So none of this sounds particularly complicated to me. I mean, it's easy for me to look at the colonial nature of the United States and be full of rage at times. And I don't let it get to the best of me. I have my coping mechanisms. I meditate. I practice yoga. I walk in the woods. I try and be this earthy dude with greater levels of success from time to time. What's complicated about it is that I'm as white as any white person in this room as well. And that comes from my mother's family. And the fact that I don't drink and that I have a greater capacity to love than fight, the kind of advice my dad would give me was, if you ever get in a fight with somebody, you gotta hurt them. You gotta hurt them so bad that they know never to fuck with you again. Well, I've fortunately never been in a fight in my life, and I intend to keep it that way. And I credit the fact that my mother has been the largest influence in my life, and her mother. I didn't know my paternal grandparents hardly at all, but my maternal grandmother was a big part of my life. She was a big sports fan. When Ted Turner created the Superstation, we used to watch Atlanta Braves baseball. She took me to Grizzly basketball games. I remember one time, this is the 70s, Michael Ray Richardson. Does anybody here remember Michael Ray Richardson? He was a legitimate NBA superstar coming out of the Montana Grizzlies basketball program until he got a little caught up in drugs and got kicked out of the league and had to go to Europe. But my grandmother, and I have this vivid memory of them playing Gonzaga, and Sugar Ray Richardson lights them up for 40 points. And every time a foul gets called on the Grizzlies, the Grizz fans are like, bullshit, bullshit. And my grandma's over there just, because that's how she was. She loved stuff like that. But I have another vivid memory of my grandmother walking into her kitchen wearing a T-shirt that I was so proud of. I was a huge Kiss fan. And Paul Stanley with a solo album picture that's purple. And Paul Stanley, like, "Hey, Mom," she didn't want us to call her grandma. We called her Mom. "Mom, look at my shirt." And she's like, "Oh, honey. Oh, honey." So that was my grandma. And my mom is probably here tonight. She's been, when my rock band used to play in Seattle, she would drive over to watch us play. She comes to everything I do. She's been my biggest fan. So that's the complicated part. Yeah, give it up for my mom. Thank you. Thank you. That's the complicated part. I'm every bit as much a white European Czech Dane as I am a raging Indian who wants to drive everybody off the continent. And that's the complicated part of what we're trying to face in the world, and this country in particular at large, is how the hell do we get along with each other when we can hardly get along with ourselves? So I mean, this isn't a story with like an arc and a big kicker, funny ending, but I feel like if I can just deal with all my raging bullshit and still show up for work on time and be nice to people and yeah, if I can do it, you can do it. So thank you. Thank you.
Chris LaTray for president. All right. I'd vote for Chris. He's much taller than I am, though. Thank you, Chris. Stephanie Land's work has been featured in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, The Guardian, Vox, Salon, and many other outlets. She lives in Missoula, Montana. A warning for our more sensitive listeners, Stephanie's story features frank language about domestic violence. Please welcome Stephanie Land.
So my youngest daughter's favorite book lately has been Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece. We read it in my bed at night, and then she asks me, "Can I please have your arm?" And I stretch it out for her to use as a pillow. Then she usually asks me to be covered by a blanket, and I lie there and wait for her body to start twitching, for her to make that final sigh before I can get up and go into my kitchen, pour myself a glass of wine if I have some, and stare at the floor. When I told my husband to move out last spring, Coraline was about to turn 4, and she started sleeping with me again at night. For those first couple of months, she would wake up in the middle of the night crying, asking why her mom and dad weren't there at the same time anymore. I never really knew what to tell her. And then she would ask me, "But don't you miss him?" And I would just say sometimes, even though that's not true. I have never, not even once, missed him. He hasn't lived with us for about 5 months now, and all I have to do is imagine him walking from one room to the next, and my body begins to show the signs of a panic attack. My friends have been really supportive throughout this whole divorce process, and a few of them have offered me some comforting words, telling me that they're sure that there is a man out there for me, one who will appreciate me and all that I have to offer. And I kind of chuckle at this, and I am tempted to say to them, why on earth would I want that? But that kind of thinking goes against the canon of almost every single story that we're told. I've watched my daughters take in the lasting kiss before the final end credits of so many movies, and I cringe at almost every one. Except my oldest daughter and I, Mia, have taken to watching some of my favorite movies from the 80s when we're traveling alone together. And at the end of the summer, we were having dinner, and I was quiet for a little bit, and then I started blurting out some kind of weird questions, like, what if Andy stayed with Ducky at the prom and didn't go out to chase Blaine into the parking lot? What if Johnny Castle didn't come back to do the final dance number and just moved on and opened up a dance studio, and then we saw Baby join the Peace Corps? So my daughter's 11, and she has a writer for a mother, and she's used to these weird outbursts, and she sat there and chewed her cheese quesadilla thoughtfully, and then she said, but it wouldn't be a story if it ended like that. And I said, what do you mean? Like it wouldn't be complete? And she said, yeah, it's only a real story if people fall in love in the end. That's how you know that they're going to live happily ever after. So over the last year and a half, when people asked me about my happily ever after and what it was like to be a newlywed, I wasn't really sure what to tell them. Because 3 months after we were married, I'd called the police, and they'd come to my apartment and taken pictures of bruises on my neck. The police left that night just a little bit after midnight. My husband was already down at the station, and the dog was still completely losing her mind. And I stood in my kitchen, leaning against the counter, staring down at brochures and illustrated flyers on my table, demonstrating signs to watch for after experiencing strangulation. We were alone for several months after that, me and Coraline and me. Meanwhile, my husband told me that he would commit suicide if he was convicted of the felony or had to go back to jail. But most importantly, he made me feel like it was my fault that he had to hurt me. So I decided to advocate for him and for his charges to be lessened to a misdemeanor. I arranged meetings. I met with lawyers and prosecutors. I wrote statements and so many emails. I even stood in front of the judge and begged him to allow my husband to move back in with us so that we could go on being a family again. When the judge granted this, it had only been 4 months since my husband had strangled me, and he said because of that, it was against his own better judgment. I wish that I would have or could have said that it was against mine too. But the fog of the situation was so dense that I completely lost sight of my compass. I think maybe my desire as a single mom for that happy ending was like a rushing current that was too strong for me to fight. I knew that I had chosen a path, though I wouldn't have admitted it then, that was full of emotional landmines. I also knew that in walking that path, one of those landmines would detonate, only this time possibly with my death. When I started posting on Facebook this summer that I was single again, a few local women reached out to me, and they sent me kind of similar messages saying, "I was so worried about you." And it reminded me that there had been a newspaper article with my husband's mugshot as the main photo, and that I watched people share that on Facebook for several days. It made the lie that I'd been living, parading us all over town and social media as this loving couple for the last year, feel like some kind of wound that had opened up all over again. I hated it that I had done that I had hidden what he had done to me as much as possible. I ran from that article. I even emailed the editor of the newspaper, begging her to take it offline from their online archives. I isolated myself from my community. I didn't talk to close friends about what was going on or what had happened or about the emotional abuse that was happening at home, because admission would require action, so I didn't really talk to anybody. My whole life felt like a lie, but I was really good at telling the story, especially to me. So a few weeks before I told him to move out, we were all in the backyard together and playing catch. It was one of those days where it's just warm enough where you think winter's behind you. And I also felt like maybe the misery of winter was over and his court case was done. He'd just adopted my youngest, Coraline, and we were all so happy, and Mia turned to me and she said, "You really know how to pick the good ones, Mom." She was talking about her stepdad, a man that she had watched hurt me twice in one evening. I looked at her and I smiled, and then I looked over at him and I went inside to cry. Over the last several months, I've kind of been asking myself what my motivation was in keeping our life on the outside as normal as possible. And I think I maybe didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to let all of those people who were so happy for me down. Then I realized that I was included in that group. So, in the book, The Missing Piece, the reader follows this really simply drawn line throughout all of the pages. And on this line is a circle with a triangle-shaped piece missing, a lot like a piece of pizza. And so the circle goes along singing this silly song about looking for its missing piece. And in the meantime, it meets worms and beetles and frogs, and butterflies land on it, and it stops to look at flowers. And after a few failed attempts, it does find its missing piece. Only it can't sing anymore, and it starts rolling so fast that it can't stop to look at flowers or talk to frogs or beetles. Things start tumbling so out of control that it sets the piece down, scoots away, and starts singing again. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Steve Brester and his wife are native Missoulians, graduating from Sentinel and Hellgate, respectively. They both attended University of Montana and have been married for 34 years. They have 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren. Steve is a retired City of Missoula police officer who served from 1992 to 2012. Please welcome Steve Brester.
So one of the proudest days of my life was when I got hired at the police department in 1992. I'd worked really hard to get there, and very competitive back then. And for the next 20 years, I served this community with honor and with pride and with professionalism. And my career became who I was. And being a cop is stressful. And a lot of guys deal with it by, some guys run, some guys go to the gym or whatever. I drank. So I'd go to work all day, do my cop thing. When I got home at night, though, I drank. I drank to relieve my stress. And this continued for many, many years. When about 16 or 17 years into my career, I developed a issue with chronic pain in my back. And I did all kinds of, I went to the doctor, did all kinds of imaging and tests, and they tried different things to fix it. Nothing worked. And back in the day when nothing worked with chronic pain, they treated it with pills. Now, I'm already an alcoholic by the time I got to this point. And the only thing worse than giving an alcoholic a bottle of scotch is 100 Vicodin. And I remember getting that phone call when the nurse said, "Hey, doctor called in 100 Vicodin for you with 3 refills. Go start taking these pills right away." And so I did. I wasn't stupid. I'd been a cop a long time. I'd seen drug addiction and I'd seen alcoholism, and I'd seen them both. And, but man, I remember when I first took those pills, it was fucking amazing. It's like somebody puts a warm blanket around me and I get all fuzzy feeling, and my stress and anxiety, they're gone. My pain is gone. I have energy. And I just thought, God, where have these been all my life? And for a long time, I took these pills like I was supposed to, like they were prescribed to me. But that didn't last forever. I do remember the day, though, that I knew I couldn't drink like I'd been drinking and take these pills like I was taking these pills because I'd been at enough houses where people had died doing just that, whether by accident or on purpose. And the next thing that happened to me is in 2010, I wish I had a good story like I was chasing a bank robber, but I was going home for lunch, and I got in a serious car crash. And the result of that car crash was that I got a traumatic brain injury. Now, my traumatic brain injury showed up like this, like an absolute memory erasure. I couldn't remember anything in the short term. I could remember, who I was, and who my kids were, and, where I went to school and all that, but anything within the last week, month, minute, I couldn't remember. And so I was at home trying to recover from this, and I remember quite clearly, the brain injury was kind of cool in a weird way. Like I could watch Law and Order, and then I could watch Law and Order, and then I could watch Law and Order. And my wife hated that. But the other thing I did was I'd it's time to take my pills. I take my pills, my pain pills, right? And I'm on better ones by now. I'm on Percocet and et cetera, et cetera. So I take my pills, and then 10 minutes later I'd go, oh, I don't think I took my pills. I better go take my pills. I'd watch a Law and Order, and then I'd go, God, it's 12:30. Did I take my pills at noon? I go take more pills. And it didn't take long before I went absolutely off the rails in terms of taking these medications like they were prescribed. The other thing that happened as a result of this brain injury was I lost my career. Couldn't be a cop anymore. Couldn't remember what I was doing or who I was or when I was there. And I never planned to lose my career that way. I was a cop, right? I mean, was my identity, and when I lost that, I didn't know why I was here anymore. What am I supposed to do next? What's my purpose in life? I mean, when I went to work every day in law enforcement, I really, truly felt as if I was helping people, and sitting on the couch at home was not helping anybody, and I fell into a deep depression. As I go through this process of getting a new prescription each month from my doctor, I'd take all of my pills, my 90 or 100 pills, within 4 or 5 days, and then I'm out. And then you're in withdrawal, also known as being dope sick. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of dope sick, but I'm telling you that it's like the flu times 10. Your bones feel like they're going to explode, and you can't think straight. You have crushing anxiety and depression, and the vomiting and all that goes along with it. It's debilitating, and it takes quite a while to get over. Now, as I'm going through this process where I'm getting my pills, I'm dope sick. I'm getting my pills, I'm dope sick. This is a month-to-month issue. And I'm still wondering, what the hell am I supposed to do now that I'm not a cop anymore? And I had the opportunity at one time, there was an opening at the Montana State Crime Lab here in Missoula. The crime lab takes evidence in from all over the state, analyzes it, sends it back, does their part of the state, law enforcement part of it. And initially I thought, all right, this is perfect, because if I could get back into this kind of criminal justice area, I'll get this feeling back like I have meaning and purpose in my life. And so I took that job, and it was the worst decision I've ever made. Because it wasn't long before I was at the lab, and I'm dope sick, and here comes evidence, right? I'm getting meth, I'm getting heroin, I'm getting marijuana, and I'm getting bags of pills. And one day I went into the back where the drug locker was, where there's no cameras, where nobody else was working. And I remember this like it was yesterday. I know I'm the one that opened that bag, right? But it's like I I was looking down at myself opening this bag of pills. Because that was the antidote to my sickness, at least at the time. And I did that. I did that 69 times while I worked at Crime Lab from 2013 to 2014. Now, I'd been a cop a long time, and it wasn't hard to figure out, hey, this is not good, right? Every time I do this, this is a felony. Every time I do this, has the potential of putting me in prison for 10 years. But I didn't care. I didn't even care what my family thought or what they were going through. All I wanted was those pills. And eventually, the lab, figured out, hey, something's wrong in the evidence section, and I got fired. And when I got fired, the investigation began, and like I said, I knew, here I am, I'm a retired cop, and I'm looking at spending 10 years of my life in Deer Lodge. And I can imagine for a normal person looking at prison time must be scary as hell. I was absolutely frozen in fear. And so I was sitting at the house. This is 2016. It was March 12th, 2016. My phone starts blowing up. Hey, what's going on? What's this? What's that? What's the other? And I looked, and there was a Missoulian article that said, hey, Steve Rester, retired police lieutenant, stole every bunch of pills from the lab. And I'm like, oh my God, nobody gets it. Nobody knows what this is all about. But I knew what to do. I went down and bought a bottle of scotch, and I went home and I started drinking. And then by the time my wife and then my adult son showed up home to visit that night, I decided I knew what to do next. I went down, I got a loaded revolver, and I was trying to get out of the house because I was going to put it in my mouth and pull the trigger. And I didn't want to do it in the house, make a mess for my wife. My son tackled me and disarmed me and saved my life that night. Thank you. This issue with the criminal offense, I did get 10 years in prison, was suspended, and I got 690 hours of community service. And this community service has absolutely blown my life up into something I never could have imagined. My purpose and my reason for being here and the reason I get out of bed and go to work every day is I get to work at a place called Missoula Works. And I work with, thank you, I work with homeless people, chronically homeless, get them back to work. I work with people with addiction, we get them back to work. People with criminal records, we get them back to work. And my life is absolutely full again, and I have a second chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was much easier. Betsy Mulligan-Daig has a 30-year history as a clinical social worker helping families and individuals address challenges in their lives. She has been the executive director of the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center since 2005. At the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, Betsy continues focusing on helping people increase their communication skills to become better at peacemaking and conflict resolution. Please welcome Betsy Mulligan-Daig.
Anais Nin said that each friend represents in us a world that is quite possibly not born until they arrive. When I started at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, I found myself surrounded by the choir, people that thought just like me, and it was comfortable. But I believe that peace requires us to go outside the choir and meet people and perspectives that are different than us, and work on learning to understand and appreciate and even learn from those other perspectives. So I set about that work. And one of the groups that I first reached out to was veterans, because complicated history between peace activists and veterans who often seeing each other as the enemy, right? Lots of groups never returned my calls. A few didn't want to be in the same room with me or on the same committee with me. And one group told me I wasn't welcome at their events. But still, I kept searching, and that search brought me to the Veterans Day ceremonies each November that Dan Gallagher from American Legion Post 101 would organize. When I first started going, I stuck to the edge of the crowd, not really knowing if I was comfortable or welcome or not. But over the years, I edged more toward the middle, started to get a little more comfortable. I recognized some people, they recognized me, and it felt easier to be there. Dan and I had introduced each other to each other, so we knew each other. I knew him. But it wasn't until we were both interviewed for a film about the old Missoula peace sign that we actually began to talk to each other. Now, this peace sign stood a big 30-foot by 30-foot board at the top, the very top of the North Hills overlooking Missoula. You know it. It actually was used by the phone company to bounce cell signals down to the Bitterroot, right? But some activists from, I think, the north side of Missoula one night decided that it needed a peace sign on it, so they painted a peace sign on it. And the phone company painted over it, and the activists painted the peace sign back, and the Quest painted back over it, and this went on for 18 years. I loved that peace sign. Because to me, it represented everything that I was working for. It represented the world that I wanted of tolerance and acceptance and justice. It was one of the things that drew me to live in Missoula, and I was so proud to be here where this peace sign overlooked my city. So, yes. So it was such a surprise to me to find out how much Dan Gallagher hated that peace sign, detested the peace sign. Now, in the Army, he worked with explosives, and he had actually planned out how much C4 it would take to blow that peace sign up. We could have gone back to our separate worlds and, after that interview, not stayed together as friends, but something kept us together. You know, being interviewed for that film, it was interesting that the thing that divided us was actually what got us talking to each other. And we had lots and lots of 2-hour lunches at the Uptown Diner in Missoula. I was always early, he was always late, and somehow we met in the middle. I saw the pride that he had following in the footsteps of his father and his brothers and answering the call that JFK had put out to serve his country. And I also saw him trying to make sense of a 40-year disconnect between that pride and the hatred that he had seen on the faces of anti-war protesters when he came back from Vietnam in 1969. I came to see how deeply he cared and loved his fellow veterans and the people of Vietnam, especially one small girl named Thuy, who he continued to carry her picture with him. He hoped that his time there had been of some help to the people of Vietnam and hoped with a great amount of pain that his explosives that he had planted had not harmed her or other children like her. This was a man whose sense of service above self was enormous. He was known as the lunch lady at Loyola, where he volunteered. Gave of his self to his community time and again. And he also was able to see me and see how important the peace sign was to me. Even though he hated it, he saw what it meant to me. He saw that it represented all the things I was working for, the things that were important to me, my values. Over the years, he gave me lots of things that had a peace sign on it, like this bracelet that I still have and wear. And one day he said to me, you know, your willingness to stand up for what you believe and your work for peace are just as important, just as honorable a way to serve our country as my service in the Army. What an affirming thing for me to hear. How wonderful for me to hear that, what that meant to me, for him to say that to me. In 2011, Dan asked me to speak at the Veterans Day ceremony, the same one I used to go to all the time. He jokingly offered me a flak jacket. And I have to tell you, it was probably the coldest day I can remember. And as I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of uniforms and red, white, and blue, it's like, maybe that flak jacket might be comfortable. Nevertheless, I said what I came to say, and I said, I'm sorry. I am sorry that many of you were harassed and called names by people protesting the war. And I'm even sorrier that they did it in the name of peace, because it didn't make peace, it made division, and I regret that. I looked over and Dan's face was just full of emotion. I still have a thank you note that he wrote me telling me how much those words meant to him and how much he'd waited 40 years to let go of that pain. When I was done, and lots of people in the crowd came up to tell me the same thing, how much those words meant to them and how important it was. And I felt like I'd made a connection. I had finally found that connection, and I was part of this larger community. In 2016, Dan died. He honored me by listing me as one of his pallbearers to carry his casket to his final resting place. And I was very proud to give that last final gift to my friend Dan. Thank you.